I want to tell you about Texas radio and the big beat.
High fly ball into right field. She is gone.
The purpose of this Zoom meeting is to remember Huckleberry Chuck Clemens, who was really a very unique kind of personality, a very original radio personality, and he was also part of a very exciting era at KMN 129 Radio, which signed on with the new format in March of 1962, and he was one of the originals. And so I thought it would be great if we could just sort of talk about our memories of Huckleberry Chuck Clemens, who passed away on Thanksgiving Day. That's November 26, 2020. And I think it'll be fun to see what comes up. I'm Chuck Street. I'm a San Bernardino native. I was born and raised there, and I was lucky enough to be in town when KMN signed onto the air on March 10th, 1962. And I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce some of the people who are with us today. First of all, there's Jim Mitchell, who was at KMN as a disc jockey. And in fact, he came in 1963 and he followed Huckleberry Chuck Clemens on the air. So they would switch chairs when Jim would start his shift. And Jim has had a very, very accomplished career over the years. After I came in, Jim left and went down to San Diego to KCBQ, where he was a jock, and then also for a time the program director. Eventually ended up at 93 KHJ in Los Angeles, where he was a newsman and then eventually news director. And all of this, he was still in his 20s. And then after the Robert Kennedy assassination at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, Channel 7, KABC TV, was very impressed with Jim's coverage of the shooting and all of that, and they offered him a job, and he was at Channel 7 for probably a couple of years, right, Jim? You were there doing the 11 p.m. news, and then you went to New York doing weekend news on WCBS television. I think you took a break for about a year to travel through Europe, and you came back and your agents suggested that maybe a good place for you to end up would be Louisville, Kentucky, right?
Yes.
So I think I got it right. And then you spent quite a bit of time there. And I know during that time, man, you're an achiever, that's for sure. While you were on television in Louisville, you got your law degree, you passed the bar, you became a pilot, you were the single engine, multi-engine. Fast forward, you ended up in Arizona, where you were on the faculty of the University of Arizona teaching media law. And in your spare time, you wrote 3 different mystery novels.
Yeah,
so I think I got the high points there. And so the rest of us now are going to feel like underachievers as we talk about some of our resumes. We're also really happy to have with us today Sheila Brown, who was the office manager at KMN. And she was certainly there during what I consider the golden era at KMN between 1962 and 1966. She stayed in the market for quite some time, eventually getting into sales, becoming a sales manager, and then eventually a station manager. And she still lives in the Inland Empire and is happily retired. Next up is Jim deYong. He's another guy who was lucky enough to grow up in the Inland Empire and to witness the magic that was present on the radio at KMN 129 Radio. When I first met Jim, it was over at Valley College, their radio station, and I think you'd already left, and by that time you were a junior at the University of Oregon, and I think your major was advertising. But also at that time, I think your family owned a dairy, and I think you realized that you didn't want to be a part of the dairy business with those kind of hours and probably low profit margins, and then you graduated from college and got into advertising as a creative director. I think you were personally responsible for co-creating a couple of very successful ad agencies in Orange County and did extremely well with a great reputation. And then next up is Ted Ziegenbusch. Ted, I think your birthday is the same day as the Cayman signed onto the air. What, March 10th, 1962?
Yep, that was it. And I was a young kid, got my first transistor radio on the day that they launched the new format. And so I figured they'd done it for me. You know, it was for my birthday. And it was just a weird coincidence that all those years later I would end up working at the station is pretty remarkable.
Well, it was a dream come true for you, but I wanted to just talk briefly about your career. You've had a very successful career over the years. You moved on from San Bernardino after working at K-Man and KCAL FM. I know you went to Las Vegas for a few years. You were on the radio there and quite successful. Then you went to San Diego and were on the radio there, very successful. I remember visiting you one time when the station was a Mexican license. And so the business offices were in the city of San Diego, but you had to go across the border to Rosarito Beach to do your show at the transmitter site. And then, of course, Ted came to Los Angeles and then was very successful on Coast 103 FM with a little interlude there over at The Fish, a Christian rock station. And you just recently retired. So I thought it was important to just talk about the background of the people who are participating on this call. I thought we would start with Jim Mitchell because Jim came to K-Man maybe just a few months, less than a year after K-Man had signed on the air. And I think you replaced Don Tyler. Is that correct, Jim?
Yeah, Don was doing 9 to noon and was the production manager. And that was the job that I took when I came in the summer of '63. So K-Man had already made its mark, and they were a mighty strong radio station already, and I was amazed at how much recognition and fandom the station had already picked up by that time. So I didn't have to do any of the heavy lifting of getting that thing started and finding an audience because it was there when I arrived.
Well, Jim, you were pretty young. I think that you definitely qualified to be a boy wonder because I believe you went to college in Honolulu at the University of Hawaii. And I think while you were there, you actually were on the air at K-Poi AM, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I got a job at a smaller rock station based on some other contacts I had in Los Angeles radio at KFWB, where I was kind of a groupie and hung around the station and helped out when I could. And somebody recommended me to the manager at this station, KORL. And I worked there for several months, and then Ron Jacobs called me. And Ron Jacobs called me is pretty much the story of my career through the rest of radio, because I also worked for Ron at KMAK, KMAK in Fresno, and at K-Man, and then, of course, at KHJ later.
Now, when you came to K-Man, you indicated that the station was really already pretty well established. It had already generated some huge ratings, but you followed Chuck Clemens. So what was that like when you would occupy the chair? What was his mood usually when he got off the air? What was your perception of him when you first met Chuck Clemens?
When I first met him, how could I sum it up? I would say hugely successful. That was clear to anybody who just showed up in the building and realized what an impact that he was making on the air. But he was different on the air. He was not what you'd call a rigidly bound by format or constrained by any of the usual things we had to worry about. He was very much his own personality, and fortunately for everyone, the audience, his coworkers, and him, his own personality was enormously creative and original, sometimes prepared, but sometimes off the top of his head. He didn't have what you'd call a conventional radio voice, the downtown Burbank sort of thing that a lot of radio guys, even rock jocks, had at that time. It was a little bit lighter than that. So everything about him, you said unique and original, Chuck, and I mean that describes him as well as anything in a couple of words. He was his own man, and there wasn't anybody like him anywhere.
Sheila Brown, you were at the station. You said that you were hired in December of 1961, and the station was in the process of changing hands from a company that supposedly one of the investors was Bing Crosby. But the station, as Ron Jacobs called it, was dormant. It didn't have any ratings at all. So they brought you over in December, and then they started to hire the jocks within a few weeks after that. And I think they hired him like earlier than a lot of stations would, and they had a lot of jock meetings that Ron Jacobs would preside over. Do you have any memory of that time when they were getting ready to go on the air as the new came in?
What I remember the most about before we hit the airwaves, actually, they did have a lot of jock meetings, but they weren't in my vicinity where I was, because I was out in the Maine. There was a great big Maine area, and that's where my desk was and everything, and that's where I was most of the time. So when they had the jock meetings, they were back in the back area where the control rooms and stuff were. So I didn't see much of that. I heard, a lot of noise, say, but wasn't really exposed to that part of it. I was just there once they hit the air, and we all knew what was going on and everything. And it was very exciting. What I would say about Chuck is everything that Jim said is exactly what I was going to say, how unique he was and what kind of a mind he had that was definitely different. And he wanted to be different. I remember him telling me one time that he knew he did not have a voice for radio. So he had to come up with other things to be unique and stand out. And the fact that his name was Clemens and that he was related to Samuel Clemens, he decided that he was going to play off of that. He took it one time and said, well, I think I'll see how this goes. And then they went in and they started the Huckleberry thing and stuff, and it just took off like gangbusters. He'd have little contests for young kids calling in and stuff to be different characters and stuff like that. It was truly remarkable. He was very, very creative. There used to be a couch in front of my desk, and after he got off the air, he would come and sit on that couch. And sometimes he'd be there for a couple of hours, and sometimes he'd be preparing for a show, or sometimes he'd just get an idea, or sometimes he'd just sit there and just gabbing at you, and letting it fly. That's my most outstanding memories of the early days with him right there.
Chuck used to talk about his 300-pound secretary.
Yeah.
And he was really referring to you. But as I recall, as a kid coming in there to just hopefully get a few minutes and look through the window to watch the people on the air, you were not 300 pounds. I think you were barely 100 pounds, right? But he still developed that character.
Right. Maybe 120. I'd like to correct something. I was not the office manager. I was the traffic manager. There was a gal named Maxine Stillwell that was the office manager during that time.
Okay, and so for our viewers, tell us what a traffic manager is, because I did traffic reporting for 28 years in Los Angeles, but tell us what a traffic manager does at a radio station.
Well, a traffic manager, you have a daily log, and you put in all of the commercials every hour, and the point of it is to keep one Ford dealer away from the other Ford dealer in the same 15-minute period or 20-minute period or something. We laugh now because we watch them on television, and we notice they run back to back, and they don't seem to care about any of that at all anymore. And we used to break our back making sure that, oh, my God, he had 15 minutes. And then you had to rotate the times. That you couldn't have it at the same time every day. So that's basically what the job entailed. It was very time-consuming. I used to say it was the worst job in radio.
Well, you have to have an attention to detail. It sounds like that. But you also assigned the commercials to the jocks to record the commercials, right?
No, I didn't assign them. It would depend on what the salespeople had asked for and what they had sold. If they had sold something and they had requested a certain disc jockey and, they were getting a, talent fee or something for it, that was set up differently. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Mostly, I don't think they did.
I don't remember Huckleberry ever doing any commercials.
I don't remember him doing any either, to tell you the truth.
I can remember a few he did, but they were few and far between, and I always wondered why.
Well, part of it was his temperament, too. If he didn't like something, he wasn't going to do it. He could be very stubborn when he wanted to be, too.
Another kind of practical factor there, too, and that is that a lot of the sales people came in with commercials ready to go late in the day. They'd been out, they'd made their client visits, maybe taken a client to lunch, talked about what they want to do, and then the salespeople would come back to the station, write up the ad, and that left me mainly to do it because Chuck, the morning man, would have been gone. Yeah, Chuck would have been gone, and Bill Watson was on the air, and Willie was there, or William F. Williams, and in those days when I was there, and but basically I was it, and it was kind of a struggle to keep too many of the commercials from sounding the same with the same voice, and I think that's probably a difficulty that radio station production managers at that time at a station our size probably had a lot of. You didn't have that many people standing around waiting to do commercials.
Right. And if Brian Lord was in the building, he would be doing music and on the phone all the time. So
yeah,
he was never available either.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Ted, so you and I are almost exactly the same age. I think you're 6 days older than me. What are your memories of the early K-Man? Again, I call the years of 1962 to 1966 the golden era.
Right.
At K-Man 129.
I don't recall how I got past the gatekeeper, which was Sheila, right, at the front door. But I must have, as a young kid, said, could I take a peek behind the curtain here and see what is going on? And I would have been all of 11 years old at the time because Don Tyler was doing middays, and somebody ushered me back next to the newsroom, the K-Man newsroom, and I think the door might have been ajar, which it was frequently. You could hear the teletype going, and I looked through the window and I watched Don Tyler doing part of the midday show. And to this day, I remember the song that was playing. He was playing Ray Charles and I'm Busted. Was this song that was on the radio, but that was my first glimpse. And I think Lyle Kilgore may have been in the newsroom getting ready to do news. I watched for a few minutes and then I was ushered out the door. And that was my first experience, to actually see the K-Men at work. It was a year later, believe it or not, that I took it upon myself to do a phone survey. K-Men was bragging about being number one, and nobody really doubted that except the people at KFXM. So I thought, I'm just gonna do a phone survey here and call a bunch of people in the middle of the day and when I'm not at school and ask them what station they listen to. And as a 11, 12-year-old, that was, I guess, a pretty bold thing to do. For one thing, most people would hang up on a young kid calling, but I told them I was doing a radio survey and what was their favorite station. Well, as time went on, we got into the hundreds, and I said, I'm getting close to 1,000 people. I'll do this till I get to 1,000. So I did that, and I took the results. I called up the radio station, and I said, I've done this, and I would wondered if I could come by and drop off the results. And somehow Bill Watson got the message, and he had me come down to the station and brought me into the control room, put me on the air, and mentioned that I had done this survey. And unbeknownst to me, until he announced it, he said, and you're the winner of the Bill Watson Spike Award for this week. I had no idea what that was. But Bill had a railroad spike from his days of working in the railroad. He kept a box full of these old nails that he would give you as the Bill Watson Spike Award. And so that was my next experience. I don't think I didn't meet Huckleberry until several years later when I was in junior high school. Somebody said, I know where Huckleberry lives. I said, no, you? Yeah, I do. He lives in an upstairs apartment in Del Rosa. And I said, you're crazy. They go, no, really, we need to go up and knock on his door. And he'll come to the door, and Huckleberry on site, right? Everybody saw him on the Came Entertainer and, at appearances and things. And so we got this wild harebrained idea to go up to the door, knock on the door, and tell him we were on a scavenger hunt and we needed an old Came entertainer, one of the record surveys. And he answered the door. And when we mentioned that, he just cracked up. And he said, I don't have one. And that was my first time. I told him that later when I saw him years later. He didn't recall it happening, but I said, believe me, as young kids, we wanted to do anything to get around you guys. So that was the next time that I met him. And then, of course, I invited him. We had the 10th year birthday party, March 10th of 1972. And I got this harebrained idea to invite as many of the original Cayman as we could find to come back or call in or be on the show. And Huckleberry was one of the first to say, absolutely, I will be there, definitely. And of course, with Huckleberry saying yes, that kind of put the pressure on everybody else at the time. But we had quite a party for that 10th birthday. And I took a picture with Huckleberry in front of Sheila's desk. Sheila probably was the one who was holding the camera because it was me and Huckleberry, just the two of us. And that's the only picture I have of the two of us together, although I met him at several other reunions and, Cayman get-togethers over the years. And I think I mentioned to Chuck one time, I was doing the morning show at FM 98 in San Diego, KIFM, and Huckleberry called on the request line, and he got through it. He says, Ted Ziegenbusch, and I was using Ted Wayne on the air in San Diego, but most people knew who I really was. And how the heck are you? He says, this is Huckleberry, and we had reconnected for a little while over the phone there. So, he dropped in and out of my life over the years. And I missed when he came back. People have asked me when he came back to Cayman the second time around 1973, were you there? And I said, I had just left to do mornings across town at KCAL FM. And so I didn't get to enjoy any of that second time around for Huckleberry when he created his frog.
Tyrone
the Frog. Yeah, Dusty Morgan was the program director at Cayman at the time, and Dusty knew very little about Huckleberry's history other than the birthday party and the event that we had. So Huckleberry had a second go round for the Inland Empire all those years later. Was a star a second time around, but I was already across town at another station, I guess, competing against him. To be honest with you.
Well, Jim deYong, you go way back as well. I think you were able to connect with Huckleberry way back. As I've seen a picture, and I think it was on your blog site, to where you baked a cake with the Cayman logo on it, and you took it to the station. And
no, you're a little off on that story, Chuck. They actually had one of the strangest contests Cayman ever had, a cake baking contest. And I made a cake. I don't know what I was, 15. I wasn't old enough to drive, so 14, 15. I made a cake that looked like the illustration of Huckleberry on the Came Entertainer. It looked just like it. And I won third place. And there is a picture, I'm very proud of this actually, in Chuck's house, the house he lived in at the end. Above his easy chair, above his favorite easy chair, hung a picture of Huckleberry, young Jim, and that Huckleberry cake. Very proud that he had that on his wall all these years.
Yeah. I have to just real quickly say, Ted, you talked about your first visit to the Cayman studios. I remember my first visit and coming into that lobby, and the newsroom door was open. It was really a very small room.
Oh, yeah.
Almost a closet, but on the other side of the glass, you could see the person who was on the air, the disc jockey, and it was Jim Mitchell. And I remember two things. I had heard your voice on the air for, probably several months, but to actually see you in there in the booth and your lips moving and that golden voice coming out and hearing it on the the speaker that was the monitor speaker that was in the lobby. I mean, it was just magical. I couldn't believe it. And how old were you at that time, Jim?
Well, if it was 1963, I was 21 when I started there. Actually, it depends on whether I got there before or after my birthday, which is in July. So I would have been 20 or 21. Yeah.
But by then, you'd already been on the air in Hawaii, right?
Yeah, right. Chuck nicknamed me the Kid, and that stuck, of course. It irritated me in a fun. But I was the Kid.
Well, one of the other things I remember about you, Jim, is the second K-Man walk back and forth. You were in that, right?
Yes, I was. I sure was.
It started at Paris Hill Park, and there was a parade. And as I recall, you seemed very tall, and you were wearing some type of hiking boots, as I recall, as you were walking behind probably Bill Watson's Corvette or something like that. How long did you last in that walk back and forth?
Too long. I don't remember exactly how long it was, although I was not what you'd call a finalist in the competition, not not by a long shot. I think I had a Lawrence of Arabia costume of some kind, with flowing robes and all that, but I didn't do as well in the desert as he did. I can remember the huge crowds following Chuck. That would be typical for a big event like that. And I remember the blisters on my feet. It lasted for a long time. Every time I do something these days, that makes my foot sore, I think of that walk back and forth. That's my memory from that one.
I have a great walk back and forth story. Because you guys were all out walking, they had to bring in guys from Fresno to put on the air. And I remember them promoting that Robert W. Morgan was going to come in and replace Huckleberry. And I was just insulted that they thought someone could replace Huckleberry. So I listened to this Robert W. Morgan guy, and I wasn't impressed at all. He could not hold a candle to Huckleberry, I thought. And many years go by. Actually, I called Ron Jacobs, the genius behind K-Man. I called Ron Jacobs in Hawaii, had a long conversation with him. And he shocked me by saying the best morning man he ever had, the best morning man who ever worked for him was Huckleberry. And I said, well, what about Robert W. Morgan, who had since then gone on to such huge success? And RJ said, nope, when Huckleberry was at his best, there was nobody better. He was better than Morgan. Pretty good compliment.
For sure. And so, Jim Mitchell, you worked with Robert W. Morgan, right?
Yeah, in Fresno and in Los Angeles. I'll tell you a funny story. I don't want to take too long on it because we're mainly talking about Chuck. But when we were in Fresno, Morgan sent a tape down to KGB in San Diego, an audition tape, thinking he might get a job there. This was before any of the Drake or Jacobs or anything. A fellow named Dick Drury had come in from St. Louis to run that station at that time, brought some other people. Morgan sent the tape down there, and he did not get the job, but I got a call from Dick Drury. And apparently something of mine had been on the end of the tape after the Morgan part ran out, and Drury offered me a job. This is so preposterous sounding to radio people who know Bob Morgan's history. And I went down there and worked for a few months before K-Man called. It was just before I came to K-Man. And Morgan laughed about every time he saw me for the next 10 years. He'd look at me and laugh thinking about that story. And I laughed too.
Yeah.
It happened, funny things like that in radio. And it was at that station that Jacobs called and said, hey, K-Man, open up 9 to noon production. And away I went. Wasn't any fun at KGB at that time, but K-Make had been fun, and I knew K-Man would be. And in fact, that's my overriding memory of being at K-Man, was the fun everybody had. People talk about the great business success and the ratings and all that sort of thing. I don't think there was a day went by during the time I was there that everybody wasn't having a good time. It's a remarkable thing to say about a radio station.
Well, Sheila Brown, you witnessed some of that fun.
Actually, when Robert W. Morgan came down, I didn't realize he was on during Huckleberry's show. I had gone in because I didn't get to finish everything because everything had been so crazy that week. And so had gone in to do some work, and Robert W. Morgan was on the air then. Now, I have to say that I was really impressed with him. I don't know whether he was as entertaining in the hallway as he was on the, maybe he wasn't that entertaining on the air, but he certainly was in the hallways. And we had a wonderful time that weekend. That was my first and only encounter with him. But I don't remember him being on for Huckleberry, because I thought that was just over the weekend that we did the walk back and forth.
They must have worked some long shifts over that weekend, though, I would think, or multiple shifts.
Definitely. It was a long haul.
Morgan was brilliant in the format, but Chuck Clemens was brilliant in spite of the format. It didn't matter at all what the format was. He was going to be sensational and off the wall and brilliance off the top of his head. It could have been a classical music station. He'd have found a way to make it work.
He'd sit on that couch and he'd moan and groan because his family didn't like him in the business. They wanted him to get a real job. He'd say, he'd break up laughing and he'd go, "This is a real job. What else can I do with a voice like this?"
His brother was a doctor, so how do you measure up to that?
Yes. And they always were after him to come back to Arizona. At least the first year or so, I remember when he was there that we used to go out to lunch quite a bit. He'd sit on the couch for a couple of hours. They didn't really, he didn't have a lot of people around him off the air, it seemed like. And so he spent a lot of time, at least a couple hours in the mornings, every morning it seemed like, on the couch in front of the desk. And then a lot of times he'd show up at 1 o'clock and we'd just go out and have lunch and stuff. And he'd just, one of those people that, and he was always a delight. Very interesting person on his own without being involved in radio too. We had very, very interesting talk.
Well, one of the most emotional, if not the most emotional moment on Huckleberry's farewell that was recorded and has been floating around somewhere still decades later was when he mentioned Sheila. When he mentioned Sheila and Paula, that was where he really choked up.
Yep.
So we knew that, you definitely had a close relationship and had shared a lot of memories during that short time that he was there. You meant a lot to him.
Yeah, well, was a good friend for, it just seemed to meld for a while there, sometimes you fill in when somebody needs something and you're just right there and talking and stuff. And, he was so interesting in other ways too. He was into politics at the time and stuff, the Barry Goldwater thing, because he's from Arizona and stuff. We used to have massive talks about things like that. He's just such a keen intellect, but so wonky at the same time. And he'd get an idea and just buzz with it and just run with it. And you could almost see it. He'd be sitting on that couch and he'd get a flash of an idea. He'd pick up a yellow pen and he'd start writing stuff down. He'd say, what are you writing? You'll have to listen tomorrow. He'd say. And I said, yeah, but I'm not getting up at 6 a.m. I'm not going to hear you till 7:30.
He told me that he would buy every magazine on the shelf every week, sit in his apartment on the floor with all these magazines around him, just trying to come up with ideas, trying to relate pop culture to his K-Man show.
Well, that's like taking the cow pasture. I think that was originally his idea. It might have been Ron Jacobs, but Ron Jacobs did mention being in the cow pasture. He thought, turn a negative into a positive. But I think Chuck just ran with it, with the cows and all that stuff, and did a lot of bits about us being out in the cow pasture. And that was before San Gorgonio High School was behind us or anything. So that was really an interesting time too, because they did little bits all the time about the cow pasture. Don't remember if Ted or you guys remember that or not.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's stuck for a long time. People said, "Oh, you work at that station out in the cow pasture," and people didn't forget that. And at times we knew we were out in a cow pasture. If you'd go out sometimes we'd have to take field strength readings in the middle of the night or something. And, yeah, this was Dairyland. This was...
Well, it's like they used to leave the control, not the control room, but the, off of the control room there was the where the engineering was and everything. That room would get really, really hot, and they would leave the door open. And so a couple of king snakes got in one time.
Oh, geez.
And of course, these disc jockeys, being the ones wonderful guys that they were, would just pick these things up, put them in our wastebaskets underneath our desks. This is Paula and I, and the next thing you know, you hear a little bang, bang, and then something, and you look down, and it was, I think they were called king snakes. They weren't, poisonous or anything, but they weren't garter snakes either. They looked big. They were kind of scary looking, at least if you didn't know anything about snakes, and I didn't. And I think one time Chuck was, I don't know if I've told you this or not before, Chuck, but when I came from New York, because I was scared of earthquakes and stuff, and they all knew it. And we had an earthquake not too long previous to this episode. And I went into the restroom one time, and they got up on the roof, 2 or 3 of them, Chuck and 2 other guys, and they started banging and ringing things and screaming and yelling. And oh my God, it's an earthquake! It's an earthquake! And stuff like that, trying to scare me while I was in the restroom. Just some of the little pranks that they used to do when they weren't on the air.
Well, it seems like in those early days, there was some enthusiasm for ping pong. Didn't you have a ping pong table out there in front of the radio station?
They had a ping pong table in front in where the slab was out in the front until Watson got his Corvette, and then he parked his Corvette in there and put rope around it so we weren't even allowed to touch it and go near it and stuff. But they also had darts, and they'd stand right where my head was at my desk, and then they had the dartboard where the newsroom was. But just before you went down the hall, the dartboard was right there. And we used to have a client called Bill Ellis, and he'd come into the radio station, and these guys would sit there and throw darts for half the morning, and you're trying to get stuff done and everything, and they're whizzing these darts over your head. But these guys also, every time they had some kind of a promotion, like one time they had scooters, and everybody had these little riding scooters and stuff. So what do? They have them outside, and do they stay outside? Oh, no. They come right through the main door, running around our desks and everything and stuff, and then going back outside and stuff like that. They were constantly doing things like that.
When Chuck made his second trip to Cayman, I was already off in LA working in advertising, but he invited me out to his house in Grand Terrace one day and said, "You ever played ping pong?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a pretty good ping pong player." Well, he just kicked my ass. I mean, I forgot that the guy was an incredible college athlete.
A swimmer.
He was a swimmer at Stanford. Yeah, and just a great athlete, which explains why he won the walk back and forth.
I don't know. He had a bad back, so that was in spite of it all.
He still had, bad back, but he just kicked my butt in ping pong.
I believe that.
Very competitive guy.
Very competitive. He and William F. Williams would do the walk back and forth, and it was always a question of which one, because we used to call Williams the Mad Marine, and you never knew what he and Huckleberry were doing, and one would be ahead, then the other one would be ahead, then they were this and that. You'd get to Riverside, and the first walk back we ever had, Ron Jacobs actually voiced it, and it was unbelievable. That was magic radio to me. I never heard anything like it. And he made that sound the most exciting thing that you'd ever heard. And when I finally left the radio station, I think that Friday night, and I went out to see it on my way home because he had made it sound so exciting. And here these guys were just walking along what they called the Gaza Strip between San Bernardino and Riverside with a bunch of kids following them, and no excitement whatsoever. But on the radio, it was unbelievably exciting. Anyhow, I was saying he and William F. Williams were both very competitive, and so one would get to, I think it was Riverside Plaza, and they turn around and you'd wait to hear whether they were coming back or not. And of course, both of them did, and of course, both of them made it. both times, both walk back and forth.
Well, I think that as that walk back and forth progressed and the jocks started to sort of melt away, it was just Huckleberry and it was William F. Williams.
Right, just the two of them.
And you had that dramatic commentary on the radio about what was happening. And I think there was a point when there were 7,000 people following Huckleberry Chuck Clemens.
Well, I wasn't there when that one happened. That must have been later on because, like I said, mine was Friday night, early Friday night. But even then, he had made it so exciting that, you just couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to get out there and see, oh, my God, all these throngs of people must be wonderful. And it was nice, but it wasn't the way it sounded on the radio.
So, Jim Mitchell, with your memory, did Huckleberry ever get any trouble with Bill Watson, the program director, or Jerry Jolstad, the manager, for some of his zany things he was doing?
Well, it's hard to believe he wouldn't have at some time. But to tell you the truth, I don't remember any big confrontations. I think that Bill, as program director, he was never a dictatorial kind of program director, but there were things that PDs have to watch out for, certain announcements that have to happen at certain times and making sure that things are done according to the format. So it wouldn't surprise me if they had a little quarrel about that, if one of Huckleberry's bits went on way too long, which it might have, but I'll bet you nobody ever tuned out on them. So the arguments were probably not too bad.
Well, Jim deYong and I, we stayed in touch with Huckleberry throughout the following years. And Jim, you talked about the correspondence that you had with him. And can you talk about some of that? You actually sought him out, I think, in West LA when he was a stockbroker.
I went to visit him in Phoenix and visited him in Los Angeles. Oh, I got a good one for you. This just occurred to me. When he was in San Diego at KCBQ, after he left K-Man, he went down to be morning man at the #1 station in San Diego. And my parents were leaving town for the weekend, my dairy farmer parents. And, dairy farming is an intensive business. It's hands-on. So my dad, as he walked out the door, said to me, "Don't go anywhere. Stay around, keep an eye on the place." As soon as they got out of the driveway, I jumped in my car to drive to San Diego to see Chuck Clemens. And halfway there, I got rear-ended. Totaled my car. And I thought, well, I'll go home. And I had to hitchhike home from halfway to San Diego. And I thought, how am I going to explain this to my parents? I'll just when they come home, I'll just talk to them, see how their weekend went, how their travel went, and then I'll break it to them gently. But that fell apart as soon as my dad walked in the door, and his first words were, "Where's your car?" So I blame Huckleberry for destroying my car.
He and I worked together in San Diego, and one of the great things that would brighten your day would be if you made Chuck laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I'll tell you, there was a certain laugh he had if you sort of caught him unexpectedly, when it wasn't like you were just telling a long story or something like that, but just a remark that tickled his funny bone, and there were a lot that did, and he would burst. This laugh just came from somewhere deep inside, the sound of delight. At KCBQ, the newsroom was around, everybody remembers the studio that you could see from the corner at 7th and Ash. The newsroom was way around in the interior of the building somewhere, and Chuck would go walking back there once in a while. We had a newsman called Ed Deverell, absolutely terrific announcer and news writer, really, really wonderful guy, and a character in an almost Damon Runyon-esque sense, if that was possible in San Diego in the 60s. And he was eating lunch back there when Chuck walked by one time, and Ed was kind of hungrily, snorting down the fast food that was brought in from somewhere. And Chuck just stood there and watched him for a while, and Ed's going, and then he looks up and he sees Chuck, and he said, "I'd be no good in a famine," and went back to eating again. And you could hear Chuck laugh from all the way around the corner of the building. I said to him later on, "What were you laughing at so hard back there?" And he told me this Ed Deverell story. And it was just such a treat to be able to do that with him and to get that laugh out of him. And he had a great time laughing, and you had a great time if you could see him laugh. Wonderful sense of humor.
You're at Arizona State or University of Arizona?
University of Arizona in Tucson.
Well, I thought I might go to Arizona State.
Uh-huh.
So I drove over to Phoenix to check out the campus and opened the car door, and it was about 108 degrees. And I said, forget it, I'm not going here.
That was a mild summer day.
Yes, it was a beautiful spring day. So while I was there, I looked Chuck up because I knew he was working as a stockbroker there. And when I walked into his office, he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I've been carrying this letter for you around in my briefcase for months." And he'd written a 10-page letter to me, giving me tips if I was going to get into radio and be a disc jockey. But one of them that he was quite proud of, the one point in that letter that he was most proud of, was that he said, and Ted will be surprised to hear this after his great career, but Chuck said, "There's no room in radio for tenors. Go into advertising."
Well, Huckleberry gave me hope, I guess, because I definitely did not have the voice. When they told me that they were going to put me on Cayman on the weekends, I mean, nobody was shocked more than me. I had grown up around the radio station, and I knew all the guys, Watson early on and Brian Lord, Johnny Darren, all of us, had interaction together. And I became, much closer to the Dave McCormick, Johnny Helm era, because by that point, I was a high school news reporter. But even then, I mean, I had aspirations of being on the radio. And I think Chuck Street was there. Jim Markham, the engineer, said, he says, "You remember Huckleberry had this Indian tribe or whatever?" And he said, my name for you was Chief Little Voice or something like that. And I said, "Where is this coming from?" And he said, "I got to be honest with you. You've had a remarkable career, and I would have never believed it with a tenor." Again, the tenor voice thing. Guys with tenor voices just don't get on the radio,
He was self-conscious about that to some extent, but he had a good sense of humor about it. I remember one time for a few weeks, this was when the James Bond movies became very popular, and I wrote a little satirical sketch that we ran every couple of days, a little 2-minute called them James Bomb. And of course, I gave myself the starring role because I was doing all the work and producing them and everything. And I just grabbed anybody who was hanging around the building that day, any of the jocks, to come in and do the other voices, the supporting players. And for some reason, in one of those things, we had Smokey the Bear. I have no idea what Smokey the Bear was doing with James Bond, but he was there. So I asked Chuck if he would do the Smokey the Bear voice. And he said, "Sure, I'd be glad to do that." So I give him the script, and he's at the microphone. He reads it, and I realized that didn't Smokey say, like, "Only you can prevent forest fires"? That sort of, so I was expecting a bigger voice. And I said that to Chuck. I said, "Could you make Smokey sound a little bit bigger?" And he looked at me for a second with this incredible double take, and then he just burst into that laugh of his, like, "No, I can't." And he laughed for 5 minutes. Took us a while to get the production started again, and we went with Huckleberry as Smokey the Bear and his Huckleberry's natural voice.
I'm just curious, do any of you remember the reason behind Huckleberry's Poor Devil cards that he used to give out at appearances? Because I had a friend who got one of those, and she said it was one of her most cherished possessions as a junior high kid, was Huckleberry giving her a Poor Devils card. And I saw it. It was a black business card that said something like, "You're a poor devil," and had Huckleberry's caricature, but nobody seems to know exactly what the connection was or what the meaning was. Isn't it funny, though, all the little things that he created? I mean, his mind must have been going 100 miles an hour with all of these ideas, and some of them stuck, some of them didn't, and we're still trying to sift through everything that he'd done.
What was it, Chuck, 10 years ago or so that you flew us down in your helicopter to have lunch with Huckleberry?
Yeah, you and I hooked up here, and we flew down there in the Jet Ranger, and we landed at Montgomery Field, and we had lunch with him, and that there was a Mexican restaurant upstairs in the air terminal at Montgomery Field, and then we took him for a flight, and we flew over his house, which overlooked the Mission Bay, and he didn't look too comfortable.
When we got out of the helicopter that day, I hadn't seen him in years, and we walked over, and he throws his arms around me and says, "Smiling Fox, how are you?" After all those years, he remembered the stupid name he gave me in the Indian tribe. Yeah. Smiling Fox.
Well, he was Chief Raunchy Wolf, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Chief Raunchy Wolf. You know, one of the things that I remember that I thought was so cool, and I didn't really witness it, but I certainly heard about it a lot, is that Chuck, his morning show, apparently started talking about this upcoming high school football game between San Bernardino High School and Pacific High School. And during his words about that upcoming game, he suggested that San Bernardino High School was going to win the game. And so then he started getting all kinds of calls from people from Pacific High School who were not happy about what he said, and he put them on the air. And finally he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll meet you after school out in the practice field and we'll have it out." So at the end of classes that day, there were a couple hundred people that showed up out there in the field, and then Huckleberry showed up in a chartered helicopter, and they were buzzing the kids, and Huckleberry was dumping baskets of ping pong balls on top of them. And so, of course, they loved it. They loved it. And that just kind of became part of his legend,
Better than turkeys, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
Absolutely.
For sure. One of the things that I lost track of Huckleberry probably for almost 20 years. And then when I decided I thought it would be a great idea to nominate that crew to the Cruisin' Hall of Fame as part of the Route 66 rendezvous. So I sent him a letter. I somehow got a good address for him, and then began regular conversations with him. And Jim deYong, I think you'll probably agree with this, is that I don't think Chuck really realized the impact that he had on the listening audience in the Inland Empire. I mean, he was huge. And I don't think he ever totally realized how popular
never realized the impact he had on so many people. Didn't get it at all.
Yeah, that was amazing to me. But I guess when you're in the middle of it all, you just don't realize it. But he indicated that when he went to KCBQ, it was such a different atmosphere. I think he was used to the fun that came in, the camaraderie, the success of the promotions, which probably were more possible because it was a smaller community. It was just so much different at KCBQ. And he indicated that, walking the halls of KCBQ was like strolling through a mortuary. So I think that was probably a little bit harsh, but just the difference for him was just startling.
It was harsh, but I'll tell you, there were no two businesses I can think of in the same line of work that were more different than K-Men and KCBQ at that time. There are a lot of reasons for that, and some of them are way more complicated than anybody watching us now would care about. But Chuck was pretty close to the mark in his description in terms of what it was like internally there, and it was a world away from sitting in that big room in the front of K-Men with Sheila and any of the jocks who came by, and that family feeling. It really was like a family feeling, and that didn't exist at KCBQ. And I hasten to point out, I don't have any beef with that station or the Bartels or anyone else. They were all really good to me, but it didn't have the same, there just wasn't that joy when you showed up to work.
That is the word he would have used at K-Men, the joy. In fact, there's a story that I don't know when, maybe mid 1965, because Brian Lord was still there. And Brian Lord is the source of this quote. He said, Cayman had started to lose it a bit, and Huckleberry looked at Brian and said, God doesn't live here anymore.
Mm.
Wow. Were you surprised, Sheila, when Huckleberry left the station? I think Watson might have left just before he did. They were so successful. Were you surprised when they decided to move on?
No, he'd been restless for a little while. You know, it's a good thing, but it's going away kind of feeling.
Yeah.
Permeated the station a little bit in those that year, I'd say maybe 6 months or so. And so, you know, you hated to see it, but no, you weren't not really surprised. Everybody was, you know, it's like maybe it's time to move on type thing.
Yeah, to move to a bigger market.
Well, yeah, and they wanted to make more money and become more successful. And they'd seen a couple of the other guys. You know, we used to say that we were on the way to Las Vegas, we would lose more disc jockeys because LA radio people would hear them on their way to Vegas or on their way home from Vegas. And the next thing you know, we lost somebody. Next thing you know, somebody's in LA. This one's doing a tire commercial. This one's doing that. You know, a lot of different things happened. We lost an awful lot of people just by them listening to the radio station on their way to Vegas. And so I think they just felt that it was time.
Yeah, for sure. So Ted Ziegenbusch, I know that today is your 43rd wedding anniversary, and I promised you we wouldn't keep you more than an hour. Anything you wanted to share before you head back to the arms of your bride?
No, wow. My goodness. I'm still amazed to this day that I was lucky enough to grow up around there. I've said many times, you know, what if I had not wiggled my way in as a young kid? When Bill Watson had me come in and talk about the poll that I had taken, you know, by calling people at home as a 12-year-old, my mom, I got home and I said, yeah, I was he put me on the radio and he gave me an award. And she said, does he have any idea how old you are? You know, because you're 12 years old. I guess I always looked a little older and I was a little taller, but I just felt like the luckiest guy in the world, because as the regime changes took place, I felt like I had lost some, because each of them, you know, had made somewhat verbal commitments to me as the unpaid intern that, you know, helped with the record surveys and helped doing different things. You know, Bill Watson would promise me something and then I'd look up and he's gone. And Brian Lord said, that's okay. I'll take care of the agreement. I'll take care of next thing. He's gone. Johnny Darren says, that's okay. I'll take care of you. And, you know, I realized early on that, you know, this business is a little transit, and, you know, people come and they go. And somehow I was able to hang around there until 1973. And by that point, definitely, you know, the landscape had radically changed, you know, from what it was in the early days. And, you know, Sheila was there for a great deal of it. And she may, you know, recall the people who came in later were, as you might expect, a little offended, you know, by the history and all the attention that was given to the 60s. Even
it didn't help that we called them the second string either.
Yeah, that's true. You know, now, but you know, because Dave McCormick was part of the Ron Jacobs crew. While McCormick was there wasn't so much of the animosity or the hard feelings.
No, everybody got along very, very good when he was there.
Right.
And it was a nice feeling too. Yeah. He was just a genuinely nice person, and it permeated throughout the radio station.
Oh yeah.
But I have to say, you couldn't have, for somebody that had never been in radio or anything, and to walk into something like that, it was great. Didn't make any money, but it was a wonderful era.
Yeah, and then see people people to this day think that Cayman must have just made a fortune in those days, because they had 40 shares in Afternoon Drive, and all the guys were. I told Huckleberry, we were in the last time that we sent postal mail back and forth was back earlier this year in like May, June. And I said, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but you guys were legendary to us. You were every bit as big as the biggest movie stars, the biggest TV stars. We chased you to the talkathon, the wake, every event.
The build-a-thon, yes.
The build-a-thon. They sold T-shirts and sweatshirts at Harris Company downtown.
Oh, when they had the treasure hunt.
Oh,
and they went out in that field and they dug up there. And, we got in so much trouble with the police and stuff for that one. They crowd control. They couldn't control the crowds and stuff.
But it truly was, and I realize it was a different era. We didn't have the available sources of entertainment that we have today. But truly. Even when we threw that the 10-year party in 72, hey, we knew that there was probably never going to be a time again on radio like 62, 3, 4, 5, 6. I would say, 67, things started changing. And, maybe it was the guys rather than the call letters or the music they were playing, but you can claim it was Ron Jacobs. But hey, that was a team. I mean, that was an incredible team of talented people. When I was sick and home in the middle of the day, I would listen to Jim Mitchell and think, gosh, that guy's just the smoothest guy in the world. It was just...
And he was.
He never missed a... He was so entertaining and so easy to just... You felt like you were communicating, even though you couldn't talk to him. You felt like he was talking to you directly. And I think that's an art that is gone thanks to Boss Radio and some of the other things that happened. But there will never be a time in San Bernardino radio for sure. But it's too bad, that people can't live through the sheer joy. I mean, the hair standing up on the back of your head with everything that they say. And not only for those of us who got into the business, because obviously those of us who have lived in radio owe our career to people like Jim Mitchell and Huckleberry and the people who were there early on. But you talk to the average person on Facebook that lives in San Bernardino that hears about I remember radio, or they pick up on things that we post about Cayman. They have story after story after story about how that meant everything to them.
I hear all the time from different people when they find out where I used to work or what I used to do and stuff like that. Oh my God, they want to tell me all these stories about how they did it. And then they want to pick my brain. What do you remember about this? What do you remember? Do you remember about that and stuff? And, that's a legacy in itself, too. I think that's kind of wonderful, too. So you guys did good.
Yeah, it was a fun time. And I was just so fortunate to be there when I was, and that the guys let me into the building as a little kid, and let me hang around. Just the legality. I mean, nowadays, let alone worried about lawsuits or tripping over something or, what if he gets hurt or things like that. They never even thought about that in those days. It was just...
No.
Yeah. Crazy.
Well, Jim deYong, you were obviously inspired by the creativity that you heard daily on Cayman, and you went into advertising. Is there anything you wanted to say before we conclude?
I will just tell you that I don't know, it was the second talkathon when Chuck was out at Paris Hill Park in a trailer. And it was the night of my sister's wedding. And I showed up. My parents, for some reason, decided it would be okay for me to go out and stand outside that trailer all night to watch Huckleberry talk. And there I was in my tuxedo. And he looked out the window and saw me, motions me inside, hands me the microphone, and says, if you look like an MC, you're going to be an MC. He said, I get a 5-minute break every hour. You're going to sit here while I take breaks, and you're going to talk to the crowd. And I really don't think I said anything but he told me what a great job I'd done. And I thought, this is a creative, cool way to make a living. This is what I want to do. I'm glad I didn't go into radio, but it was inspirational. Chuck was inspirational. Cayman was inspirational. I'm just happy. Like Ted said, I'm just lucky I got to live through it. I couldn't be happier.
Good. Jim Mitchell, anything you wanted to say as we conclude this?
Well, so much has been said that encapsulates it all pretty nicely. I just would add that in all the following years of my broadcast career, I never heard anybody do it better than Chuck did it. And it's not like there was some manual with a checklist of, things to be a great radio personality. He just went out there and was Chuck. And I Huckleberry, And I should add one thing, too. When he became a stockbroker in Los Angeles, when I was living there, he called me up, wanted to sell some stock to me, and he did. He sold me my first stock that I ever bought, and I made money on it. So all my feelings about Chuck are going to be good forever, but mostly from the radio and that great friendship.
Great. All right. Well, listen, it's been a very, very enjoyable hour or so here to reminisce about the amazing Huckleberry Chuck Clemens. May he rest in peace. Thanks to everybody for your participation today. It's been really a lot of fun. And
thanks for including us.
Good to see all your faces again, except for you, Sheila.
Trust me, you're better off this way.
I doubt it. Jim, nice to see your face again and hear that voice.
Thank you. Good to see all of you too. And Ted, hello. We meet actually, sort of.
Finally, yeah.
The way people meet these days.
That's right.
See you in Hawaii.
Good to see you. Hey, and Jim deYong, one question for you, because you might know, if anybody. Why did Huckleberry always say, I am not very political? And he was.
Rapidamente, por favor, I'm not political. Ended the show that way every day.
I haven't heard that in 50s, I don't know how many years, but I remember.
Rapidamente, por favor, I am not political.
I don't get it.
He said it because he was very political.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a line from a movie or something,
No, he loved Barry Goldwater, and a few years ago, I gave him a Barry Goldwater for President original poster that I found.
Is that his Tino Delgado is alive moment?
That was kind of his Tina Delgado. Rapidamente, por favor, I am not political.
Not political, yeah, I remember that one.
Now we know the rest of the story, okay.
Right.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks again, guys.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Good talking to all of you.
Talk to you later, Chuck.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Out here, and I think I'm overproducing my departure from K-Beta, which is what is happening right now. I've been sitting here bawling between every record, and now it's my turn to cry through a record, if you could believe that. That's right, friends. This is Huckleberry's Swan Song. And I'd like to say before I leave, that no one will ever really understand what we all had here at K-Beta. Usually radio stations, just sort of evolve. They just go on and on. They can be good, very good, but very seldom are they great. And very seldom do they really ever become involved and even consumed by a community. Very few of you ever knew it, but for the most part, this radio station was formed by people who were down and out when they came here. And maybe that's why it all happened the way it did. It was as though the community sort of reached down in the gutter one day and they found this pathetic hunk of wet feathers and they made it grow into a pretty bird. And that's what K-Men is to me. There's been a lot of laughs here, and I think we've all grown together from the first watermelon eating contest with Dean Weber and to Dick Dale and William F. Williams and White Levi's to surfing and the walk back and forth and the great Beatles and Brian Lord and the Rolling Stones to skateboards and going barefooted and Talkathon #2. and granny dresses and digging for treasure while choking on dust, and a heat stroke ready to tap us all on the shoulder at any time, to the arrival of the great new guys, Buddy, Cece, and Dave. You know, we've all had a lot of laughs. And I'm sure you all know there never really was a Lake Huckleberry. There was only a glint in your imagination, and there never was a robot. There never was an Indian tribe. Just hundreds of little people who were tired of their homework. They made it possible. And there never was a Jerry Snow, just a two-fisted gentleman we called the Bear. And there never was a 314-pound secretary. Only a fiery little devil named Sheila, and a lovable, plump little doll named Paula. You're overacting. You know, all these things help me get through many a crummy morning, which I've always managed to hate more than all you, I'm sure. And you probably never even knew that, did you? Listen, you people be nice to this radio station. Don't throw it back into the gutter. Take care of this bird because it's your baby. And just one more thing before I get out of here. Ladies and gentlemen, I really am very political. Adios.